Well, I recently had this somewhat sad, maybe is the right language, experience of listening to a colleague share, in a moment of vulnerability, his fears that his hope of finding a wholesome young lady to settle down with and to get married to will forever evade his grasp. And he even shared something more surprising than that, which was that he has never even had a really close friendship in his life, which has obviously been characterized by a lot of loneliness. And as upsetting as that may be, it seems to me that this isn't an isolated experience, but rather a symptom of a concerning trend in our society. Researchers, they're not mincing their words when they describe an epidemic of loneliness in society today. Which, forgive me if this is harsh, but I would say this is just one more disgraceful accomplishment we can add to the experiments of modernity and the unfulfilled promises of the 20th century. This is what gets me more than a little annoyed when progressives, when they face opposition from anyone espousing anything remotely conservative or traditional in nature, they always make this vapid accusation that goes something like, oh, he just wants to take us back to the 1950s or worse, the 19th century. He wants to take us back in time. And maybe that tactic has worked well for them for the past several generations, because even when it's become obvious that the brave new world they're constructing is actually inhuman, they just dangle some distraction like a new car or an iPhone in front of us to say, see, look at the wonderful progress we're making. And if that doesn't work, sometimes they'll reveal something even more terrifying, like the nuclear bomb, to convince us that we need them to protect us from the awesome power that they themselves wield. But honestly, I think that strategy is proving less and less effective, because I think people are starting to look back at the past and ask themselves, are things really getting better? Did we actually trade up? Just to be clear, you mean the past when kids played outside, exploring the world around them and forging lifelong bonds with other real human beings? The past when a single income was enough to provide for a family, including a home, two cars, and a guaranteed pension? When kids' books in libraries weren't in the habit of celebrating sodomy as like this harmless pastime and didn't promote gender dysphoria as a healthy expression of one's identity? In which young men weren't saddled with the guilt of all the evils committed throughout the course of history, as well as quite a few invented evils, simply because they were born men, something that they can't change, in which massively powerful tech companies didn't prey upon the psychological vulnerabilities of teenage girls in order to score a quick advertising payday, in which our media, while not perfect, wasn't an unthinking partisan machine devoted to political candidate's whims, no matter how demonstrably corrupt he or she is, in which it wasn't hard to find a family doctor at an affordable rate. Is that the past we should be terrified to return to? Well, if all the bounced checks of the modern era aren't enough, now you can add an epidemic of loneliness to the accomplishments of the progressive, brave, modern new world. It's like, wow, we sure have come a long way from those rotten old days when people used to have friends. But hey, at least we can now get on with the important work of championing inclusion and diversity. Although who wants to be included in a society in which people don't even have friends? So to share just a few more statistics about this particular epidemic, Pew Research reported that 30% of adults are neither married or living with a partner, nor engaged in a committed relationship. 30%. And as of 2022, for the first time ever, I believe, the majority of women in the US are single. This is correlated with a fact from the CDC that alcohol abuse and addiction among women has recently experienced unprecedented growth. Previously, this was always seen as like a problem for men, right? But now women have jumped on to the, I want to say bandwagon, but I'll say paddy wagon maybe, in increasing numbers. And that makes sense when you don't find joy and satisfaction in life through healthy means like relationships. You will cope through unhealthy means like addiction. And there are lots and lots of reasons we could identify to fix the blame for yet another collapse of a vital aspect of our society. But that isn't the point of this video. All I have to say is this is one more symptom of the death throes of a culture living through its last portions of decadence. And if you don't want to fall victim to it, then there's not much else to do but to withdraw from it. My advice is find a traditional pocket of society where people are not pressing on the gas pedal forward as everything good collapses around them, and then shelter there in a traditional community and maybe even build a life there. But that isn't the problem for my colleague. He is finding his refuge in traditional Catholicism. So what gives? Why is he still finding the prospect of romantic love so hopeless? Now, I wouldn't want to try to diagnose him specifically, but in returning to the wider symptoms of our culture, I find one statistic extremely revealing, which is that 15% of men reported having no close friendships in 2022, which is a 500% increase since 1990. So hear that again. They're not saying they don't have as many friends as someone in the early 90s. They're saying they have no close friends, none. They have nobody. They are adult men who are just going through the monotony of life and work with nobody to share that with. And here's the thing about romantic love with the opposite sex. It doesn't come easily or naturally. We don't just have this ingrained ability to navigate those kinds of relationships. Men and women are largely a riddle to one another. Men and women don't have the same instincts, the same psychology, biology, emotional, or rational constitution, which means that getting along with the opposite sex, it requires us to make sacrifices to meet them in the middle. But members of the same sex on approach tend to just make sense, which is why it's less intimidating and easier in practice to learn to love someone in friendship of the same sex, for the simple fact that it's easier to love someone who is just like you. Someone who has the same instincts as you, same interests as you, and doesn't require all that much of you. It's a high value, low cost kind of relationship. And for someone who hasn't been conditioned by self-sacrificial love, this is an ideal first step in what it means to love someone other than yourself. That's a great genius in friendship and why it's ideal to form rich friendships earlier in life. They prepare you for more demanding relationships like marriage and parenthood later on, because romance and marriage are much more ambitious relationships and require certain measures of maturity. But if we don't even have the low-cost experience of making sacrifices in friendships with the same sex, how can we ever be expected to perform well in the much more ambitious opposite sex scenario? And an example that illustrates this reality so well for me is in Evelyn Waugh's novel, Brideshead Revisited. So in this story, there are two characters named Charles and Sebastian who develop an intensely intimate friendship in their freshman year of college. And our contemporary society proves how foreign this kind of friendship is by being unable to read that story any other way than by assuming that because they loved each other and they were of the same sex, it must have been homosexual in nature, forgetting that love isn't always sexual. Honestly, I don't know how some of these people understand the love that they're supposed to have for their own children. It's kind of frightening when you think about it. The fact is that friendship is a kind of love. And if there's any doubt about the platonic nature of Charles and Sebastian's relationship, Waugh explicitly inserts a flamboyantly gay character to provide the glaring contrast between himself and Charles and Sebastian. And then if that's not enough, there's a scene in which the two of them, Charles and Sebastian, are at a club and they're approached by a couple of, let's say escorts, ladies of the night. But both of them, they just kind of act dumb. They don't know what to do with this approach. So they just don't respond, having no experiences with the opposite sex. The girls in turn accuse them of being gay and then just leave them alone. But Charles and Sebastian, not wanting the accusation to stick, they do their best to entertain the ladies. The story portrays them in the early phases of their friendship as being mostly indifferent towards the opposite sex, the way all adolescents are prior to getting old enough to then take an interest. It portrays their intimate friendship as the necessary prerequisite to moving on to the more ambitious love found in romance with the opposite sex. And this was certainly my and most of my peers' experience as kids. You typically start off ignoring or treating the opposite sex with a kind of hostility. You develop deep friendships with members of the same sex, and then eventually you acquire enough social experience and equity and, let's say, hormonal motivation to begin to approach the opposite sex. In the novel, another character describes Charles and Sebastian as exemplars of the English version of this, in which it takes place at a much later age, just before adulthood. And eventually Charles's interests move on from Sebastian to Sebastian's sister, Julia. And the takeaway from all of this, including the novel, which I would recommend reading, it was written by a very traditional Orthodox Catholic, although I'm not trying to say that Charles and Sebastian's relationship should be idealized. It's not. They make massive mistakes, and it's something of a tragedy in their lives, or at least Sebastian's life is portrayed as a tragedy. And so it's not this exemplification of the kinds of friendships we should have, but that we should have intimate friendships. So that's the takeaway. Friendships are a prerequisite to romantic love. But the problem is younger generations aren't finding those friendships and the experiences that come with them. And then they hit their 20s and they think, oh, why aren't I able to navigate the challenges of romantic love with the opposite sex? The answer is because you skipped a vital step. I also want to qualify what I'm saying here. I can't speak to the female experience of this as much, but I think that this is a principle that is definitely true for men. Why? Because men have to lead vocationally and romantically and within the context of the relationship. They have to initiate it a lot of the time. And to be a leader requires greater degrees of experience, an experience that can be acquired in a safe and again, low-cost way in intimate friendships prior to moving on to the opposite sex. But because this isn't happening, it's no wonder in this age in which we've forgotten how to have rich and intimate friendships that marriages struggle as much as they have for so long, now reaching the point where people don't even know how to pair off in the first place. And yes, we can blame a lot of this on technology wedging itself between us in our social lives, promising to enhance social life, when all it's actually done is replace real-life social interactions with lazy, second-rate digital interactions conditioned by the busyness and the noise of the digital sphere and the relentless scrolling and distractions that make real meaningful interactions and relationships almost impossible. So if you're finding yourself stuck in this way, if you've hit your 20s and you're saying like, why can't I find relationships with the opposite sex that work and feel natural? First of all, my advice would be disconnect from social media and go find some real friends. Join a sports team or a dance club, or take group art lessons. Just do something that will expose you to other people with similar interests, and then make some meaningful friendships and invest everything you can into them. That will hopefully form you in all the ways you need to be ready to then find romantic love. Not to mention the fact that the best romances are found in the context of your community of friends. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support, or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.